Minorities and governments in the aftermath of the American Revolution. So, the thing is, due to the revolution, there is no more monarchy in the United States. This essentially means those provincial congresses and committees are going to assume power in all of the former colonies. So now we're going to really refer to it as the American states, because now America is a separate and independent country. As early actually as May of 1776, so before America had even declared independence, Congress had actually called on the colonies to form their own and new state governments that were under the authority of the people, going all the way back to republicanism again, legitimate political authority derives from the people. People elect officials that govern them, and officials then represent the interests of the people who elect them. Also, the people, define and limit governmental power through written constitutions. However, if you've noticed here, I say the people, the people, the people. Who is the people? The people in this case and at this time period was propertied white men. The idea being that economic and self-sufficiency can't be bought. Cue eye roll at that, but that was the idea. Everyone else is basically denied political rights. Now you might be going, wait a second, white men, what about Native Americans? It depends how you looking at color and skin tones and stuff like that. Thing is, Native Americans were outside of the United States political body. Basically, they have their own political rights in their own nations. However, when we're going back to, the American states and everything, we're generally going to see that it's somewhere between 60 to 80% of adult white men own property. The remaining 25-ish% are generally like unskilled laborers or like mariners living in port cities, or the working poor like indentured servants. What about other groups like women? So the thing is, the revolution didn't necessarily change traditional patriarchic assumptions. And of course, one of those assumptions is that, politics and public life is exclusively the domain of men. Women really were a dependent class under the control of propertied men. They were legally and economically under the complete control of their husbands. In fact, you see gender-specific language would explicitly bar women from voting in almost all the state constitutions of the 1770s. Basically, the exception to this was New Jersey's. Their state constitution is actually going to be gender-free, and it just says all adults worth 50 pounds. So actually, until 1807, propertied women in New Jersey enjoyed the right to vote. There you go. We also do see a few gains for women during this time period. For instance, you get slightly less restrictive divorce laws. This is really important because but generally people will talk about, we want divorce rates going down and stuff, especially in like modern day society. But there's an element of you always want to have some percentage of the population getting divorces because of like spouse abuse and just cheating and things like that and everything. So we're seeing some slightly less restrictive divorce laws. They're also going to get somewhat better access to educational and business opportunities. The reason is it was suddenly really important for women to be, educated and morally informed, because the woman would have to instruct their son on the principles of liberty and government, which is going to this idea of the Republican motherhood. Basically, it's the responsibility of the woman to pass on these Republican virtues from one generation to the next. So this meme here, it's actually the opposite of this meme is how women were viewed. This meme is saying that, she's important because she's just someone, whereas during that time period, she was important because, she was someone's mother, basically. You also see African Americans after, of course, the American Revolution is going to change things for them. The revolutionary principles of liberty and equality, of course, are going to convince a lot of white people to challenge black slavery. And in the North, between 1777 and 1784, most of the northern states are going to end the enslavement of people. The exceptions is New York doesn't do this until 1799, and New Jersey doesn't do so until 1804. Basically, Northern white people agreed that slavery was incompatible with the whole Revolution's commitment to natural rights, human freedom. That being said, when they freed or emancipated slaves or enslaved people, basically these laws tended to only call for the children of those being enslaved to be freed, and only when they reached adulthood. And even if you were a free black person in the North, you still had to overcome white prejudice. You might be able to vote if you met property qualifications, but generally speaking, they were poor, and very few African Americans held property, even in the North. They're going to face discrimination in jobs and housing. They're going to be barred from juries and denied their fair share of funds for like schools. Really, the African American community is going to have to rely on their own resources and are going to have to establish their own churches and their own self-help associations. But we are going to see that a lot of those who were enslaved are going to manage to push for freedom, not just in the North, but also in the South. We're going to see 1 out of every 10 enslaved people gained freedom from the war. Now, some did this through military service. Some we see this challenge of the issue of, all men are created equal and everything. And then you even see some gaining freedom in the South. And usually if one was a former enslaved person in the South who had managed to gain emancipation, they are going to flee to the North, even if they were allowed to remain free in the South. Generally, they move to like port cities. And then, of course, there are Native Americans. Now, Native Americans didn't necessarily want to be a part of the American system. More than anything else, they wanted to defend their independence. And so during the 1780s especially, you see a lot of new confederacies being forged that would temporarily unite different Native American tribes against their common enemy, that is America. They wanted political rights and control over their own lands within their nations. They want independence, not to be a part of the American system necessarily. So I ask you this as part of your journal: why is it important to talk about these minority groups? Why don't I just jump into, our state governments, which is what I'm going to do next? Why is it important to talk about these minority groups? Go ahead and pause this if you want to go ahead and answer that, and then you can press play again. So then there are our state governments. So the thing is, we're going to see at the state government level, it's going to be all written documents, which is a huge departure from the English practice and a big deal, because when you write down the laws and everything and behold all the people to it, then it's a lot easier for everyone to follow the same set of procedures, so to speak. A lot of the American people saw tyranny with all of the privileges that had been given to the royal governors under Great Britain's rule. And so we're going to see generally all of the state constitutions cut back sharply on executive power. They would make the executive branch, the governor, be viable for, annual elections, was subject to impeachment. They limited their terms. If they were the governor now, they lost the power to appoint executive and judicial officials. The thing is, you're going, okay, if they're taking away all this power from the executive, then who gets the right to do those things? And that's going to basically mean that they're going to increase the power of the legislature branches in the different states. So really, the legislatures become the focal point of the state government. They're the ones appointing officials and overseeing the military and financial matters. And generally, states would lower property requirements for voting and office holding and actually increase the number of seats, and thus make representation a lot more proportional to the geographic distribution of the population, which is a really big deal, so that you're not having the people in the back country going, oh my gosh, we're not represented. Like, you're trying to represent the entire state. At this point, you're also going to see, to make it more representative of the people, the upper houses are going to be made independent of the executive office and thus opened up to popular election. Each state is also eventually going to include a Bill of Rights that explicitly limited the power of the government to interfere in the lives of the American citizens. So, for instance, by 1784, 13 states have provisions that would guarantee religious liberty, freedom of the press, and a citizen's right to fair legal practices like a trial by jury. Now, you might be going, oh, this sounds a lot more and more like our system today. And hopefully you do recognize the similarities already to our system today when it comes to the state level. However, that doesn't mean everyone just agreed across the board how to set up their governments. There is going to be more democratic versus more conservative elements in each government. Now, when I use these terms, liberal, conservative, democratic, Republican, when I use the term, especially like right here, democratic and conservative, think of it more like on the scale of like today people say it's more liberal leaning or it's more conservative leaning, that we're looking at a political spectrum. Don't also completely compare it to today, because where their views of liberalism or democracy and what's considered conservative are going to be very, very different than the ideals today. So just kind of keep this in mind, almost set them aside like they're their own terms in this time period. So, for instance, the more democratic side in this time period wanted to open the government to all male citizens. So keep in mind, that's not even as democratic as, today, where it's not just men. And the more conservative element was really fearful of mob rule and therefore wanted to limit the government to really only the educated elite and substantial property holders. Giving you kind of more of an idea today. Have you ever met somebody that went, oh my gosh, you're allowed to vote? So that kind of element that, we only want the most educated to be able to vote. We only want the richest to vote because, if they're rich, that shows that they clearly know what they're doing, because otherwise they wouldn't be rich, although obviously there's some issues with that reasoning. Anyway, giving you some examples of that time period though. South Carolina was actually one of the most conservative states. For instance, they barred 90% of the state's white men from holding elective public office. A lot of times to hold public office, you had to hold more property than if you were just voting. And so the qualifications were so high, 90% of white men couldn't even hold public office in South Carolina. Whereas like the other side of the spectrum is Pennsylvania, was probably one of the most democratic and had the most egalitarian view of republicanism. They actually eliminated property qualifications, and on top of that, they had a unicameral legislature, so they don't have that upper house and lower house. It was just one legislature, and they eliminated the office of the governor and that elite upper legislative house. So one Congress, and that's it. Generally, still looking at all of the states, though, you're seeing this growing political equality accompanied really by the demands of those in government must be more responsive to the people. So once again, going back to the ideals of republicanism and contract theory of government.